Coming at you, A-Push students, Chapter 23, Political Paralysis in the Gilded Age, 1869 to 1896. Let me just start by saying I really don't like the way that the book divides this time period, and I think they get a lot of things wrong, and they mix up a lot of stuff. So this is going to be a shorter lecture because there's a lot of other concepts I think you need to know before we go into what's going on here. But there still are also some events in here that you really, I think, need to know about. So, this chapter is an introduction to a number of concepts we're going to follow up through in many of the subsequent chapters. So this is technically the start of period 6 for AP US history, 1865 to 1898, which is marked by the end of the Civil War and covers the industrialization of the United States and all the subsequent effects on America's growing economy. So this chapter, we're going to talk about the official end of Reconstruction, and we're going to learn about the Gilded Age and political corruption, as well as tensions in the country regarding immigration and economic struggles between farmers, industrial laborers, and the upper classes of society. So, a couple of things that we're going to be talking about a lot as we go through this historical period. Let's talk a little bit about the administration of Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was the leader of Union forces at the end of the Civil War and successfully ran for president in 1868 and would serve for 2 terms. While he was a very accomplished general, he is not known for being a very good president. And one of the things that he is known for that is considered a good thing is he does initially really go after the KKK and enforces Reconstruction measures in the South. But these measures are largely going to be abandoned after Grant finishes his time as president. His terms were marked a lot more by corruption, not just within his cabinet, but it was kind of widespread in the country. But there are also some things in his cabinet where many of his cabinet members, the people that were supporters of him, engage in a good amount of corruption. So, for example, as the Transcontinental Railroad was being built, there was a lot of speculation and corruption in railroad companies, within the courts of law and with corrupt judges, and in the financial market with people inflating the stock market. So there was a lot of corruption, just nationwide. But one of the more notable scandals in Grant's administration was the Credit Mobilier scandal, which was a construction company that was hired by the Union Pacific Railroad to try to help build the Transcontinental Railroad and other railroads to link the nation together through a railway system. The only problem was that the company, was basically engaging in insider trading, and it was giving shares of stocks to congressmen and other people in the administration in order to have favorable votes. So then these Congress people, the people of Congress would then vote to give contracts to the Credit Mobilier company. So that's collaboration that's not really, legal. So, many of the people that are implicated, one of the people implicated in the scandal was the vice president at the time. So there's also a scandal called the Whiskey Ring, where a group of government officials, they skimmed money off of excise taxes that were made off the sale of whiskey. And one of the people implicated was Grant's own private secretary. The Secretary of War during this time had to resign because he was pocketing bribes from suppliers to Indian reservations. So it was just a time of a lot of political corruption. Nothing exemplifies this more than the Tweed Ring in New York City, which your book mentions in this chapter, but I really want to talk a lot more about this once we learn about what was going on in America, other things during this time. Just so you know, for right now, William Tweed was a city official in New York City who had a very intricate and well-coordinated network of bribes and patronage in exchange for lucrative city-building contracts. This is a depiction of Boss Tweed, as he is known. One of his nicknames was Boss Tweed, and the cartoonist is named Thomas Nast, who depicted Tweed in a very negative way and eventually contributed to helping bring him down. I don't really like the way your book introduces it and then goes on other things, so we're going to talk about it a lot once we learn more about urbanization and immigration in the late 19th century. But your book mentions that it's a signature part of the corruption during this time, and it's just important to know. Again, we see an economic panic. Most of the panics are caused by banks undertaking a lot of risky loans and loaning out too much money. And then when the market shrinks, these banks don't have enough money to pay back their other creditors, and they fail. This panic was caused by too much overspeculation on building railroads. And one of the victims of this panic is going to be the Freedmen's Savings Bank, which was established as a place for black entrepreneurs to secure investments after emancipation. Investments in this bank are going to basically evaporate, and investors are going to lose about $7 million as a result of this economic panic, which is going to have pretty devastating consequences on the black community as they're trying to emerge and develop economic self-sufficiency. So as we've already talked about, this is one of the factors that leads to the federal government taking less of an interest in Reconstruction measures in the South, the fact that this economic panic is affecting the entire nation. Ulysses S. Grant is the first president to openly consider running for a third term, but this was shot down by House resolutions. He doesn't have enough allies within the Republican Party, as they are becoming divided about what to do with Reconstruction. Also, this goes against the two-term tradition set by George Washington, so the 1876 presidential race is open. Democrats nominate Samuel Tilden, who gained notoriety for jailing Boss Tweed in New York, which we mentioned in the previous slide. The Republicans nominate Rutherford B. Hayes, whose main qualification is he was from the state of Ohio, which historically was a swing state at this time and kind of flipped sometimes between Republican and Democrat. Both of these candidates aren't really known for being notable in any way. They're pretty much mediocre candidates, and neither one really had a clear interest in wanting to be president either. So when the votes come back, Tilden had 247,000 more popular votes than Hayes, but returns were not available from 3 states: Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. Voter fraud and voter intimidation were rampant during this time, and as you remember, the Democrats had retaken southern state legislatures and proceeded to disenfranchise and intimidate black voters. Historians now say that if black voters hadn't been intimidated and denied the right to vote in the 1876 election, that Hayes would have clearly won. But the vote was undecided until March. There is a congressional committee that tries to count the votes in the disputed states, but they come back with a vote along party lines as to who would become president, and there was a deadlock. So this goes on from the election in November until March, when Republican and Democratic leaders met in Washington literally 3 days before the new president was supposed to be inaugurated. They still didn't know who was actually going to be president. And it was clear that they weren't really going to decide by counting votes because most of those votes were fraudulent anyway. So what happens is the party leaders made an agreement. The Democrats would hand over the electoral votes from the 3 disputed states, giving Hayes the required 185 electoral votes to win. But there were some conditions to that. Hayes had to agree to remove federal troops from the southern states, and he would include Democrats in the dispensal? And probably a word. In dispensing federal patronage, meaning giving those good, lucrative government jobs under the spoils system to a number of Democrats. This agreement is effectively what is the end of Reconstruction. In retrospect, I don't think dispensal is really a word, but it was fun to think about for a minute. All right. So going into this, you can see that, technically those contested states, those votes do eventually go to Rutherford B. Hayes, and he does become the president. But as you can see, there was a bit of a disparity between that. This is one of the 3 races in presidential history, I believe it's only 3, where one candidate received more popular votes than the other, but still, the other candidate won through the Electoral College. The other examples I can think of are the 2000 election and the 2016 election. We talked about this a little bit in the last slide, but I want to make sure that we're all clear on this, since these are some terms you have to know for this chapter. Because African Americans now lack federal protections in the South, their right to vote was essentially taken away by state governments, who bypassed the 14th and 15th Amendments with Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow was the name of a minstrel character, which is basically somebody who would impersonate an African American. Sometimes it was a white actor who would dress up in blackface. Sometimes it was a black actor who would basically tell jokes and sing songs and things like that. And so Jim Crow was a popular name for a minstrel character from this time period who would perform shows, basically. It's not any actual real person, it's a character. But these were the laws. That's the name that was applied to state laws that were aimed at separating society and maintaining white supremacy. So it separated all public accommodations, including schools. It determined where people lived through housing agreements and basically, openly racist segregation by neighborhood. And it implemented literacy tests and poll taxes for African Americans, which effectively disenfranchised black voters in the South. It wasn't that the literacy test was like, they made it so it was impossible to pass because the person grading it would just simply reject it, even if you got every question right. And even then, it was impossible to get every question right. So just the law was inherently biased against African Americans for the express purpose of removing their participation in society. To further relegate African Americans to a lower economic strata, sharecropping was implemented and many blacks were forced into this type of farm labor. The crop lien system was the idea where shopkeepers extended credit to farmers for food and supplies for the planting season in return for a portion of the harvest at the end of the season. So even before the person has planted their crop, they already owe a sizable portion of it to the shopkeeper who supplied them with enough supplies to live during that time. Also, the person who owns the land where the sharecropper works is keeping a share of the harvest from those people as well. Since the storekeepers could establish those prices for and terms of the loans for anything they wanted, there really was no regulation on that. They were inherently engineered to keep African Americans in a perpetual system of debt, and they had no means of appeal. The Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case is one of the most notorious Supreme Court cases in American history after the Dred Scott decision. The justices in this case decided that Jim Crow laws did not technically violate the 14th and 15th Amendments because they provided African Americans with a separate but equal access to accommodations. The case was over someone's ability to sit in a train car reserved for white people when they were technically, colored, as the definition goes back then. So over time, because the Supreme Court reinforces the idea that segregation is legally acceptable, we are going to see that African Americans are going to be systematically denied services, or their services are going to be far inferior to those provided to white people, and it's really hard to overturn a Supreme Court precedent once it has been set. So this is going to effectively solidify white supremacy in the South until it faces significant challenges in the 1950s with the Civil Rights Act. For any African Americans who defied the social system of the South or attempted to assert their rights or attempted to organize, lynching was also a common practice in the South to maintain this social order. Lynching is when someone is murdered without a trial, usually by a crowd of people. And I get a lot of questions about this in class, so it's important to remember that, in cases of murder, unless you murder an employee of the federal government, that is usually a state crime that states investigate and prosecute. So, if the government of the state is dominated by white supremacists, then people can basically do what they want and justice will not be served because no one's going to look for the people who lynched an African American in the South during this time. So, in these lynchings, some would occur in broad daylight, and oftentimes people would sell tickets sometimes. There would be concession stands. Pictures would be taken and then sold to people to commemorate this act of murder. So this just goes to show you how whites in the South knew they could get away with doing this, and there was nothing that anybody could do about it because technically they weren't violating a federal law. It was state laws that were being violated, and the state didn't care to investigate and find out who was responsible because they had a clear intent to keep African Americans from challenging this social system. So I'm not over-exaggerating when I say that African Americans lived in a state of subordination, oppression, and outright terror during this time period. Here is a map that compares a plantation in 1860 to the same property in 1881. Really, it's meant to illustrate the only thing that's different is that the slave quarters have been moved to other parts of the plantation where that's the land that sharecroppers maintain, but some of those people may have very well been slaves on that plantation 20 years ago, but all that's really changed is the location of the houses, the type of labor, and also they're barred from implementing physical punishment or killing the African Americans technically, but it's still pretty much the same economic system. The period between 1870 and 1900 is now known as the Gilded Age. This phrase was used by author Mark Twain to talk about the post-Civil War era in a book that he wrote back in the 1870s. To gild something means to cover it in gold. So it's implying that everything was really bright and shiny on the outside, but at the same time there's a lot of dull stuff underneath, or maybe something wasn't right underneath the surface. This name has kind of stuck when we describe this time because there was a lot of monumental growth and expansion in the United States in terms of urbanization, industrialization, and immigration. We're going to see America become an economic powerhouse during this time, and more people are going to be participating in democracy than ever before. And it's also, actually, it is a time when more people were participating in voting and democracy than any other time in American history, including today. Both political parties pretty much had the same economic vision, and they didn't have a lot to disagree on aside from like tariffs and monetary policy, which I kind of cut out of this chapter. So we're going to see the presidential elections very close during this time, and the House of Representatives are going to change dominant parties about 8 times. It's also a time of a lot of fraud and political corruption, as well as the emergence of industrialists and urban problems, which is going to bring to light issues between the rich and the poor in society. This term, the Gilded Age, is going to be applied to events from chapters 23, 24, 25, 26. So please don't think this is just part of this chapter. One thing we're going to focus on in this chapter in particular is the idea of patronage, also known as the spoil system. You remember Andrew Jackson and his willingness to give political jobs to his supporters. This system had pretty much gotten way out of control by the 1870s. And there was a call among people for civil service reform where maybe the most qualified people should be filling these government positions instead of just friends of the people who got elected. This is going to cause actually an internal rift in the Republican Party, which is pretty much the dominant party in the late 19th century, and it's going to be addressed after the assassination of President James Garfield. Rutherford B. Hayes wanted to retire after only 1 term, and so the Republicans picked James Garfield from Ohio to help carry the election in 1880. His vice president was Chester A. Arthur from New York, who was part of the Republican faction that was very much in favor of continuing the system of patronage, known as the Stalwarts. Chester A. Arthur, in fact, had only gotten this appointment because he knew somebody politically, and that's pretty much how he got to his position, was just by being a supporter of successful people. So you had the Stalwarts who didn't want to change anything about civil service reform and didn't want to do away with patronage. And then you had what are called the half-breeds, which was a group that wanted to implement some measure of civil service reform into society. And these factions are just going to fight for authority in the Republican Party during this time. Something that really kind of throws a wrench in this and changes a lot about this is the assassination of James Garfield. So what happens is Garfield is shot in a train station by a deranged office seeker named Charles Guiteau. Guiteau believed that he was owed a position by the president, and when the president didn't respond to his correspondences, Guiteau shot him because he thought that if he killed him, then Chester A. Arthur would become the president, and since Arthur was a stalwart, he would give Guiteau a lucrative government job. So the craziest part about this is that if the doctors had let Garfield alone, chances are he probably would have lived and survived this attack. The bullet went into his back and was lodged into his hip, but it hadn't hit any major organs. But the doctors at the time didn't believe in germs being a cause of disease, and they proceeded to try to find the bullet with their unwashed hands several times. So this subsequent probing led to an infection which killed Garfield 70 days after he was shot. So the person who shot Garfield was insane, but the fact that he thought this would give him a government job made people pause and say, maybe the patronage system has gone a little too far in that people just feel they're entitled to get a government job because they support a political candidate. So anyway, the subsequent Pendleton Act in 1883 established a Civil Service Commission, which allowed for competition for federal jobs instead of simply giving them to the person who supported the candidate. It also made mandatory campaign contributions illegal in government positions. Before this, you were forced to support a certain candidate based on your party affiliation or your job. So this was seen as a turning point for trying to staff offices with more qualified candidates and reform some of the abuses that have been part of the spoils system. Now, I know what you might be thinking, that when a new president comes into office, they typically replace positions in their cabinet with people that they know. Now, that's true, but those people are typically all qualified to serve in those positions because they have experience in those offices or just relevant experience. There are sometimes where the Senate is looking at an appointee for a cabinet position and they say, you're clearly not really qualified to serve in this position. And that idea is where kind of civil service, it still acts, as a check on that today. Some other things we're going to be exploring for this entire historical time period is the emerging class conflicts between industrial workers and the upper classes. Even though railroad companies were making enormous profits during this time, Railroad workers were facing economic difficulties as a result of the Panic of 1873. Then, in 1877, workers were being told their wages were going to be cut by 10%, which triggered strikes, or a refusal to work, all across the country with railroad workers. In what's known as the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, President Hayes was forced to dispatch federal troops to quell unrest by striking laborers. The strike was ultimately a failure for the workers, which exposed the weaknesses in the labor movement. And so we're going to see that this failure is going to lead to more collective action in the future and the development of nationwide labor unions that are going to challenge their employers for better wages and changes in the company structure. One scapegoat for the economic hardships during this time period, especially with regard to the railroads, are the Chinese. We've talked about Irish immigration and German immigration, but during the 1850s and 60s, the Chinese also emigrated to the United States, largely on the West Coast, to try to find economic advancement in the gold fields in California. During this time in China, there was a civil war called the Taiping Rebellion, in which approximately 20 to 30 million people were killed, although exact figures are not definitive. So we're looking at push factors that are causing the Chinese to move to the United States. That is certainly one of them. When the gold fields were all claimed, Chinese workers were integral in helping construct the Transcontinental Railroad on the West Coast. However, once the railroad was completed and the gold fields dried up, many Chinese returned to China with money they had earned. Those who remained took menial jobs such as cooks, laundrymen, and domestic servants. This perception that the Chinese were going to take jobs away from quote-unquote real Americans is what led to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Acts in 1882 and 1892. These acts effectively prohibited all future immigration from China, and this act is not going to face a significant revision until 1943. This is significant because the first piece of legislation aimed at targeting immigrants and limiting their immigration to the United States, and it's solely aimed at one ethnic group. And going back and looking at sources related to Chinese exclusion, the way the Chinese are depicted, I mean, these are just openly racist, in their accusations against the Chinese. Over this time, we're going to see the emergence of a group called the People's Party or the Populist Party, and I just want to introduce you to them now. They're going to show up in later chapters. This group came out of an alliance of farmers, mostly in the West, that felt the government in Washington was only looking after the interests of the rich and powerful, and that farmers were being left behind. They are going to become a significant political force in the late 1880s and 1890s. And in their Omaha platform, they laid out some changes they wanted to see in government. These include a graduated income tax, meaning that you get taxed if you earn more money, you get taxed more. Government ownership over railroads and the telegraph, because they felt the railroad companies exploited the farmers. And the direct election of U.S. senators by people instead of by the state legislators. We're going to see a number of these reforms actually happen over the course of the next 40 years. But for now, it's just important to know that this group came out of discontented farmers who are going to be addressing what they feel are problems in society. And they are going to gain some political victories, as seen in the map on the next slide. They're also going to try to make a continental coalition with other oppressed workers. And one of the things that kind of points out other groups of workers that are facing hardships during this time is the Homestead Strike. So the 1892 Homestead Strike is one of many labor struggles we're going to be talking about in this class, so it's important to know. You're going to become familiar with Andrew Carnegie, who is going to be a leader in steel production, and at this time, the Homestead Steel Plant in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was one of the areas that produced Carnegie Steel. In this plant, the workers attempted to unionize because of unsafe working conditions. When these requests were denied or discouraged by the administrator of the Homestead Steel Plant, the workers then went on strike. The employers responded by deploying armed soldiers named Pinkertons to break the strike. The private security forces were from the Pinkerton Detective Agency. They're known as Pinkertons. They're going to come up a few more times in this class. They were notorious for being strike breakers and basically being private security for these employers. When the Pinkertons are coming to break up the strike, there is an armed conflict between strikers and Pinkertons, which results in 10 people being killed. The strike is broken after the National Guard is called in and the workers are forced to return to work. This doesn't make much sense now because we haven't talked about the emergence of industry and labor in the United States because your book is poorly organized again, but I promise this will make more sense as we proceed through the subsequent chapters. This map gives you an indication of where the Populist Party had the most support. Not only did they gain 22 electoral votes in the 1892 election, but you also see there are little pockets of populist support in the southern states as well. This movement is going to grow over the course of the 1890s, and we will be revisiting it in later chapters. So again, a little shorter chapter today. We're going to get into a lot more of these concepts later. Please see me if you have any questions. Thank you for listening.